There is a feeling that has no clean name in any language I've studied. And I spent 20 years studying the languages people use to describe what cannot be said. It's not loneliness. Loneliness implies absence. This is something else. It's the experience of being fully present in a room full of people who love you, people who would do anything for you, and watching the whole scene from somewhere slightly outside your own body. Like there's a pane of glass between you and every moment that was supposed to feel like home. You smile at the right times. You laugh when laughter is called for, and underneath all of it, something in you is standing very still, very quiet, pressing one hand against that glass. Watching. You've been doing that for a long time, not because something is wrong with you, because something in you was built for a different load than the people around you were carrying, and part of what made that so isolating, nobody told you, nobody could. The maps for where you were going didn't exist yet, because you were one of the ones who came to make them. Pause. I want to say something carefully before we go further. There's something I'm going to share with you in this conversation, something about what your life has actually been, underneath the events of it. I'm not going to get to all of it yet. The ground needs to be prepared before that kind of seed goes in. But stay with me, because what you think your story has been about, and what it has actually been about, are two different things, and by the time we get there, you're going to understand something about the last decade of your life that nothing else has been able to explain. The first time I really understood what it meant to be a Pathfinder, not as a concept, not as something I'd read, but in my body. The way a cold room shifts when someone opens a furnace door 3 hallways away. I wasn't standing anywhere dramatic. I was in a lecture hall at the University of Edinburgh, midway through a seminar on Indigenous knowledge frameworks, watching 23 students copy notes about ways of knowing that their entire education had spent 12 years training them to dismiss. And something in me went very quiet. Not peacefully quiet, the kind of quiet that comes just before you understand something that's going to cost you something. I'd spent years trying to make a legitimate case inside a legitimate institution, using legitimate methodology for the idea that what certain lineages carried in their bodies, in their ritual structures, in their oral transmissions across generations, wasn't superstition dressed in ceremony. It was technology. Functional, transmissible technology for navigating the parts of human experience that Western frameworks had no instruments fine enough to measure. And I believed, genuinely believed, for a long time, that the right argument, made in the right room to the right credentialed audience, would eventually shift something. I was wrong about the mechanism. I was not wrong about the content. What I didn't understand then, and what I want to offer you now, is that some things can't be moved by argument. They can only be moved by demonstration, not teaching, not persuasion. Demonstration. The difference between a person who points at a fire and explains its chemical properties, and a person who is on fire, is not a difference of knowledge. It's a difference of state. You're not here because someone explained your calling to you. You're here because something in the frequency of this moment recognized something in the frequency of what you already carry. And those two things found each other the way rivers find the sea, not by logic, but by nature. So let me say plainly what I mean when I say you came to show the way. I don't mean you came to be anyone's teacher. I'm not interested in that framing, and I suspect you aren't either. You've probably spent enough years being the person everyone brought their questions to. The person in every room who could hold the most weight. The one people leaned against without ever asking if you were tired. I'm not asking you to do more of that. What I mean is something structurally different. A Pathfinder doesn't lead a crowd. A Pathfinder walks through a burning field so that the grass behind them is scorched flat, and a year later, or 5 years later, or 10, someone who never knew the Pathfinder existed finds that scorched line in the earth and walks it. Because the path already exists. The work was already done. The fire was already walked. You are a structural engineer of something that hasn't been built yet. The architecture goes into the ground before anyone sees the building. And the ground is your life. The materials are your seasons. The foundation is every fire you didn't escape, but walked through, and somehow kept your name on the other side of. This isn't metaphor dressed up as encouragement. It's the functional description of what lineage breakers actually do, in the fabric of what gets carried forward through families, through communities, through the invisible threads connecting people who will never meet each other but who will share something because someone, somewhere, did the work that opened the way. Pause. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with this. And I want to name it because I think you've been carrying it alone long enough that you may have stopped recognizing it as exhaustion. It feels less like tiredness and more like friction. Like every step requires slightly more energy than the same step seems to cost the people around you. Like you're moving through something that others can't see. You are. The friction is real. The invisible resistance is real. What isn't true is the story you've been telling yourself about what that friction means. It doesn't mean you're failing. It doesn't mean you're broken or off course, or that your calling was a mistake, or that whatever ordering force has been shaping your life with a precision you've only recently started to notice has lost interest in you. The friction means you're in load-bearing territory. Structural engineers feel the building in ways the future occupants never will. This isn't metaphor dressed up as encouragement. It's a functional description of what lineage breakers actually do, what gets passed forward through families, through communities, through the invisible threads connecting people who will never meet but who will share something because someone, somewhere, did the work that opened the way. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with this. I want to name it because I think you've been carrying it alone long enough that you may have stopped recognizing it as exhaustion. It feels less like tiredness and more like friction. Like every step costs you slightly more than the same step seems to cost the people around you. Like you're moving through something they can't see, and you are. The friction is real. The invisible resistance is real. What isn't true is the story you've been telling yourself about what that friction means. It doesn't mean you're failing. It doesn't mean you're broken or off course, or that your calling was a mistake, or that whatever ordering force has been shaping your life with a precision you've only recently started to notice has lost interest in you. The friction means you're in load-bearing territory. Structural engineers feel the building in ways the future occupants never will. And there's something I haven't said yet, something I want you to hold as we go, because it changes the entire question of what you're supposed to do next. The question most people in your position are asking is, how do I do more? How do I reach more people, step more fully into this, show the way more clearly? That question feels urgent, but it's built on a premise that I want to gently take apart, because the premise is wrong. And what replaces it is so much quieter than you're expecting. We need to walk through some territory first, though, what you've actually already survived, what that survival means, who you were before the world decided what you carried was inconvenient, before what I'm pointing toward can land the way it should. Stay with me. Something happens very early in the life of a person like you. Before there's language for it, before there's a framework or a name or any category that would make it easier to hold, it arrives as a texture more than a thought, a slight unreality around the edges of everything, as though the world you've been placed in is a translation of something else, and you're the only one reading both versions at once. You were young when you first felt it, and you didn't tell anyone because there was no way to say it that didn't sound like a complaint, or worse, like a claim to being special. Neither of those felt right. It wasn't that the world was bad. It was that it was slightly too small, like wearing a coat that fits your shoulders perfectly but was sewn for someone 4 inches shorter. Functional, technically correct, but something is perpetually bunched and binding, and you can't explain it without sounding ungrateful for the coat. Do you know what I'm describing? Not loneliness. Not depression, something more precise than either of those words allows. The sensation of being inside your own life the way an anthropologist is inside a field study, present, genuinely caring, engaged with the people around you, and also perpetually aware that you're observing from a slightly different elevation than everyone else in the room. And it's the awareness itself that isolates you, not the difference. The awareness of it. I spent years, decades, honestly watching people for whom the ordinary world seemed to fit like it was tailored. They moved through their lives with an ease I could appreciate but never quite replicate, not because I was better or worse. Because I was calibrated for something the environment didn't require yet. That's the word I want to sit with for a moment. Calibrated. Pause. You weren't broken. You weren't too sensitive, too much, too deep, too difficult. You were a specific instrument built for a specific frequency, operating in a room where no one had yet asked for that frequency. That's not a pathology, that's a timing problem. And timing is God's department, not yours. But here's what it felt like from the inside. Here's what it costs before you understand what it is. It felt like watching your own adolescence through a pane of glass. Everyone else seemed fully inside the experience, the noise, the belonging, the uncomplicated wanting of things right in front of them. And you wanted that. You genuinely wanted it. You tried to want it hard enough to actually have it. You shaped yourself around the room's expectations. You got very good at performing the version of yourself that made people comfortable, that didn't need explaining, that laughed at the right moments and didn't ask the questions that made things complicated. And you were good at it. That matters. Because the people who come to show the way are almost never visibly strange. They're often the competent ones, the reliable ones, the people others describe as grounded, or wise, or easy to talk to. What those people don't see is the cost of the translation work, the constant, invisible labor of rendering yourself into a language the room can receive, while the deeper original sits untranslated in the background waiting. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from this. Not the exhaustion of doing too much. The exhaustion of containment, of being a larger signal in a smaller channel, of perpetually managing the gap between what you carry and what the situation allows you to put down. I remember sitting in a seminar room at the University of Edinburgh in the late 1980s, long before I'd be teaching in those rooms, still a young postgraduate researcher surrounded by some of the most genuinely brilliant people I'd ever encountered, and feeling that familiar drift. Not boredom, not arrogance. Something quieter and more unsettling, the sense that the conversation in that room, while technically excellent, was somehow beside the point of something I couldn't yet name. That we were all very precisely assembled around the wrong question. I understand now that feeling wasn't academic dissatisfaction. It was the instrument reading the room and finding a frequency mismatch. I didn't have that language then. What I had was a low-grade dissonance I mistook for my own deficiency. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from this. And it's not the exhaustion of doing too much. It's the exhaustion of containment, of being a larger signal running through a smaller channel, of spending your whole life managing the gap between what you carry and what the room will let you put down. I think about a seminar room at the University of Edinburgh, late 1980s, long before I would ever stand at the front of one of those rooms, still a young postgraduate, still finding my footing, surrounded by some of the most genuinely brilliant people I had ever met. And I felt it there, that familiar drift, not boredom, not arrogance. Something quieter than either of those. The sense that the conversation, while technically excellent, was circling the wrong center, that we had all arranged ourselves with great precision around a question that wasn't quite the question. I understand that feeling now in a way I couldn't then. The instrument was reading the room and finding a frequency mismatch. I didn't have that language at the time. What I had was a low, persistent dissonance, and I mistook it for my own deficiency. That's the trap. When you're reading a frequency the room doesn't share, the first explanation the world offers, and the second one your own anxiety offers, is that something is wrong with you. You internalize the mismatch as malfunction, so you spend years trying to fix something that was never broken, trying to lower the signal, slow the sensitivity, flatten what you know, be simpler, ask less, want less, see less. And some part of you succeeds. Because people like you are disciplined. You can do the work of self-reduction with extraordinary precision, but it costs something. Every year of containment is a withdrawal from something that was meant to compound. The turning point is rarely dramatic. I want to say that plainly because we're conditioned to expect the significant moments to announce themselves, a vision, a crisis, a single night that rearranges everything. For most people I'm describing, it doesn't arrive that way. It arrives quietly. A moment of stillness inside an otherwise ordinary day where something old stops arguing. Not resolution, not revelation. Something more like a ceasefire. The part of you that had been fighting your own calibration finally puts down the argument. Not because you figured anything out, because you were too tired to keep fighting, and in that exhaustion something honest broke the surface. For some of you it came through a conversation that went somewhere you didn't plan, a book that fell open to a page you weren't looking for, a season of solitude, chosen or imposed, where the silence stretched long enough that all the noise you'd been using to override the knowing finally ran out of material, and in that quiet, something true moved. Not in words exactly, or not quite words. Something that said the calibration was not an error. The mismatch between you and the room was never about your inadequacy. You were built at this frequency on purpose, for a purpose. And the years of feeling like an observer in your own life were not evidence of your distance from your calling. They were the architecture of it. Pause, because you cannot show a way you haven't walked. You can't hold steady on ground you haven't tested with your own weight. You can't be the structural foundation of a new pattern inside a family, a community, a lineage, if you haven't first been the person who absorbed the old pattern and decided, alone, without applause, without anyone watching, that it stopped with you. The Pathfinder doesn't study the terrain from above. The Pathfinder walks it, sometimes in the wrong direction, sometimes without adequate preparation. Often without anyone who understands why the journey is necessary at all. That's the point. The map is made by the walking. The cleared way exists because someone moved through territory that had no prior record and left something behind in the moving. Not a monument, not a book, a track, a frequency. A structural change in the field that the next person will move through more easily without ever knowing why. You were that person. You have been that person for longer than you know. And the sense of displacement you carried from childhood was not a wound waiting to heal. It was a lens being ground. It takes time to grind a lens. The process is not comfortable for the glass. What shifts now, and this is the turn, is the interpretation, not the experience. The experience was real. The cost was real. What changes is what you decide it was for. Because the evidence was always there, the question was never whether you were different. The question was whether different meant broken, or whether it meant built for something the room hadn't yet asked for. The room is asking now, what comes next? The territory I want to walk into before we leave this section has to do with what that asking looks like in the record of history, in the testimony of Scripture, in the pattern that runs through every person who was set apart before they were sent. That pattern won't surprise you, but seeing it clearly, that's something else. Because here's what the record actually shows. David passed over by his own father when the prophet came looking. Jesse lined up 7 sons and didn't think to call the 8th in from the field. Not because the 8th was hidden from the world. He was out there, visible, working. He was hidden from the consideration of the people closest to him. And Samuel nearly anointed the wrong man because Samuel was still working with human criteria. God had to interrupt the process. Not this one, not this one, not this one either. And then the one nobody thought to bring in from the field walks through the door, and the oil moves. That's the pattern. Not the dramatic arrival, the overlooked one who was working when no one thought to look. There's something the room is asking right now, and before we leave this section, I want to walk you into the place where that question gets answered, not in theory, but in the record. In what Scripture actually shows, in the pattern that runs through every person who was set apart before they were sent. The pattern won't surprise you, but seeing it clearly, that's something else. David, passed over by his own father when the prophet came looking. Jesse lined up 7 sons and didn't think to call the 8th in from the field. Not because David was invisible to the world, he was out there, working, in plain sight. He was invisible to the people closest to him, and Samuel nearly anointed the wrong man because Samuel was still using human criteria. God had to interrupt the process. Not this one, not this one, not him either. And then the one nobody thought to call walks through the door, and the oil moves. That's the pattern. Not a dramatic arrival, the overlooked one still working when no one thought to look. Gideon, hiding in a winepress, threshing wheat in secret because the Midianites would take it if he did it in the open. The angel shows up and calls him a mighty warrior. Pause, hold that for a moment, because Gideon wasn't acting like a mighty warrior. He was crouching, he was hiding, he was surviving. The title came before the evidence. The identity was spoken into a circumstance that seemed to completely contradict it. And Gideon's first response wasn't gratitude, it was argument. If God is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are the miracles? That question, that specific disbelief standing right in the face of a direct word, is not a disqualification in this record. It's practically a prerequisite. Jeremiah. The call comes, and the first thing he says is, I don't know how to speak. I'm too young, and God doesn't argue the point, doesn't say you're wrong, you're actually quite capable, here are your credentials. God says, I knew you before I formed you in the womb. Before you were born, I set you apart. The selection happened before the objection, before the inadequacy was even possible. That's the architecture of how this works. The chosen doesn't become qualified, the chosen is declared, and then the life assembles around that declaration in ways that only make sense looking back. Paul, killing Christians systematically, with institutional permission and personal certainty, not confused about it, convinced. And then something happens on a road, and the man who was the most credentialed enemy of the movement becomes its most prolific builder. The violence of his past became the testimony no one could dismiss, because if that man changed, if that particular certainty was dismantled, then the argument for the power of this thing was unanswerable. His past wasn't disqualification, his past was the evidence. What was selected in Paul wasn't a man who would arrive gentle and unthreatening, it was a man whose reversal would be impossible to argue with. There's never been a credential check. Not once in the record. What runs through every one of these people isn't preparation in the conventional sense, not study, not positioning, not enough experience stacked up to justify the assignment. What runs through them is a specific kind of being found in the middle of something else. David in the field, Gideon in the winepress, Jeremiah before he had words, Paul mid-persecution. The selection arrives not at the summit of readiness, but at the ordinary moment. The hidden moment, the moment no one is watching. So here's what that means for you sitting with this right now. The feeling you've been waiting for, that sense of sufficient preparation, of being ready enough, of inner certainty assembled high enough to justify the step. That feeling has never been the prerequisite in this record. It's been the delay. The preparation, in every case, happened inside the assignment, not before it. I want to be careful here because this is easy to hear the wrong way. I'm not saying move recklessly. I'm not saying ignore discernment or skip the quiet testing. What I'm saying is more specific than that. The readiness you're waiting to feel, it's assembled by God inside the doing. The field prepared David. The winepress was where God found Gideon. The road was where Paul was changed. None of them manufactured their own readiness in advance. The readiness was built into what came after the declaration. Sit with that for a moment, because there's something I haven't named yet, the specific cost that comes with carrying this kind of assignment. The thing that explains why some of the most clearly chosen people in any generation arrive at their assignment late, arrive exhausted, arrive still holding the bruise of years spent in a wilderness with no map and no explanation. That's what comes next, because the pattern I just walked you through isn't complete without the part most people leave out. The selection and the sending are separated, in every case, by something nobody volunteers for. And what happens in that gap, I need to walk you through that honestly. The version of this story that skips it isn't doing you any real service. You deserve the whole picture. The wilderness, what it actually does, what it actually costs, and why it wasn't the punishment it felt like. That's the next territory. Stay with me, and here's what I want you to know before we leave it entirely, before we move into what you carry and how it moves. The wilderness doesn't just prepare you, it strips away the wrong delivery mechanism. There's something I want to say about the wilderness before we move through it entirely, before we get into what you actually carry and how it moves. The wilderness doesn't just prepare you. It strips away the wrong delivery mechanism. Most people who are called arrive at their assignment carrying what they were taught to carry, the credential, the platform, the carefully constructed case for why they should be taken seriously. The wilderness doesn't take those things as punishment. It takes them as necessity. It removes what you were using to perform the calling so that what remains is only the calling itself, unmediated, unpackaged. Just the frequency, traveling without the scaffolding you spent years building around it. I left Edinburgh in 1996 holding a particular story about how truth moved in the world. It moved through peer review, through citation, through institutional endorsement. It had to be legible to the academy or it didn't count as knowledge. And that story felt like integrity to me, rigorous, earned. But what I came to understand in the years between 1996 and 1999, sitting with my father's letters, sitting with the work of healers and elders and lineage keepers who had no interest in being legible to the academy, is that I had confused the container with the content. I believed the peer-reviewed paper was the truth. It was just the vessel, and the vessel had to go before I could understand what I was actually carrying. What you carry is not a methodology. It's not an argument. It's not a presentation. What you carry is a frequency, and a frequency doesn't require your permission to transmit. It transmits through your presence before it travels through your words, through the quality of your attention, through the way you hold yourself in a room where the pressure to shrink is considerable. Through the quiet choice made without announcement to stay integrated when everything around you is coming apart. And I want to be careful here because it's easy to hear that and turn it into another assignment. Another thing to perform, another spiritual task to execute correctly so the transmission happens the way you planned. That's not what I mean. The frequency I'm describing isn't a tool you deploy. It's a consequence of your own integration. And it moves. I've watched this. I've seen it work in ways that still quiet something in me. It moves through the most ordinary acts. Not the dramatic ones. Not the declarations. The ordinary ones. Pause. In the spring of 1998, I was walking through Leith Market on a Saturday morning, still carrying everything from those years: the resignation, the rented room, my father's letters, the slow demolition of everything I thought I understood about my own authority. I had nothing to offer anyone. I was barely holding the seams of my own life together, and a woman I'd seen before at the market, she ran a small stall selling second-hand books, stopped me. Not to say something profound. Not because I'd said anything. She stopped me and said she'd been watching me walk through there for months, and she'd decided she was going to go back to her daughter with whom she hadn't spoken in 2 years. She didn't know why she was telling me. She just felt she should. I hadn't spoken to her. I hadn't offered counsel. I hadn't done anything except exist in my own process, slowly, without theatre. That's what the frequency does when it isn't being performed. I'm not telling that story to make myself remarkable. I'm telling it because I watched the same thing happen again in 2001, when I was working through the early drafts of the ancestral healing methodology, sitting in libraries and community halls and borrowed rooms, not yet publishing anything, not yet teaching anything. A young man attended one session where I simply described, without any structure or system, what I'd found in my own lineage. He came back the following week and told me he'd called his father for the first time in 7 years. I hadn't suggested he do that. The word reconciliation had never been spoken in the room. He had simply sat in the presence of someone who had done a specific internal work and hadn't hidden it, and something in him located itself. That's not my power. That's not even my doing. That's what happens when a chosen one stops performing their assignment and starts inhabiting it. And this is where I have to name the specific failure mode, because I've lived inside it, and I recognize it, and I imagine you do too. The failure mode is attachment to outcome. It's the moment a person who carries this frequency begins to need the other person to receive it, begins to watch for signs of impact, begins to explain more, offer more, push harder, because the proof of their calling has become dependent on someone else's response. And what that does, what I know that does, from years of watching it in myself, is change the quality of what's being transmitted. Because now it's not the frequency traveling clean, now it's the frequency tangled with your need for validation, your anxiety about whether it's working, your attachment to whether the other person wakes up or shifts or acknowledges what they just received. And that tangle is legible. People feel it. They don't always have words for what they feel, but they feel the difference between someone who is offering freely and someone who needs something back. The internal stance that allows the clean transmission is this: detachment from whether they receive it, a deep trust in the readiness of the person in front of you, not your assessment of their readiness, but the timing of the encounter itself. And above everything, a commitment to your own integration that comes before your commitment to anyone else's transformation. Your first assignment is to be whole, or more honestly, to be in honest, deliberate relationship with your own incompleteness. Not performing wellness, not performing wisdom, actually doing the work of knowing what you carry, knowing what it costs, knowing where the edges of your own integration are, and staying at that work without making it anyone else's emergency. There's a specific failure mode I want to name. I've lived inside it. I recognize it, and I think you do too. It's the moment someone carrying this kind of frequency starts needing the other person to receive it, starts watching for signs, starts explaining more, offering more, pushing harder, because somewhere along the way, the proof of their calling got tied to someone else's response. And what that does, what I've watched it do in myself over years, is change the quality of what's being transmitted. It's no longer moving clean. Now it's tangled up with your need to be seen, your anxiety about whether any of this is working, your quiet desperation for the other person to wake up or shift, or at least acknowledge what they were just given. And that tangle is readable. People feel it. They don't always have words for it, but they feel the difference between someone who's offering freely and someone who needs something back. Pause. The internal stance that allows the clean transmission is this: detachment from whether they receive it. A deep trust in the other person's readiness, not your assessment of it, but the timing of the encounter itself. And above everything else, a commitment to your own work that comes before any commitment to someone else's transformation. Your first assignment is to be whole, or more honestly, to be in deliberate, unflinching relationship with your own incompleteness. Not performing wellness, not performing wisdom, actually knowing what you carry, what it costs, where your edges are, and staying at that work without making it anyone else's emergency. Because here's something you already know, even if you haven't had this particular language for it. You've done this before. Not perfectly. Not without the attachment. But you've had moments, I know you've had them, where you said exactly the right thing without planning it, where something you carried moved into a room before you finished a sentence, where someone found their footing in a conversation with you, and you could feel it happen without trying to make it happen. You've already done this. So the question isn't whether you're capable of it. The question, and I want to let this sit for a moment, is whether you're willing to do it from the internal stance that makes it sustainable. Whether you're willing to stop recruiting, stop explaining, stop needing the confirmation, and whether what remains when you set all of that down is enough for you to stand on. Because what remains is the actual assignment, not the performance of it, the thing itself. And whether that's enough, whether the work itself, without the applause, without the acknowledgement, without someone finally saying yes, I see it, that's the question that determines everything that comes next. Whether that is enough. I want to stay with that for a moment, not because the answer is complicated, but because the answer asks something of you that no amount of understanding can replace. It asks for honesty. The particular kind that doesn't dress itself in spiritual language or wrap itself in the vocabulary of purpose. Just the plain, undecorated truth about whether you're willing to be what you already are without the scaffolding of proof, without an audience, without the moment where someone turns and says, yes, I see it, you're real. Pause. That confirmation isn't coming. Not in the form you've been waiting for, and the part of you that's been waiting, that vigilant, exhausted, quietly desperate part, already knows this. It's always known. The waiting was never really about the confirmation. It was about not having to carry the full weight of your own knowing without someone else's hands underneath it. You've been carrying this long enough to know what it weighs. So let me say this plainly, and I want you to let it land without immediately reaching for a reason to deflect it. You don't need permission to begin. You didn't need it yesterday. You won't need it tomorrow. The beginning has already happened. In every moment you chose integrity over performance. In every room you refused to make yourself smaller. In every conversation where something moved through you that you didn't manufacture. Something arrived, was received, changed the temperature of the space. That wasn't practice. That was the assignment, already executing. You've already begun. The question that remains is whether you'll stop treating what you are as something that needs more preparation before it's allowed to be fully present. There's a word I want to give you for what I'm describing. Not a concept, not a framework, just a word that names the specific movement I'm asking you to make. Acknowledgement. Not announcement. Not a declaration to anyone watching, just the quiet, interior acknowledgement that what you carry is real. That the years of navigating things others didn't have to navigate weren't wasted. That the specific texture of the path you walked, the isolation, the misunderstanding, the seasons of grief that had no clean explanation wasn't a detour from your purpose. It was the ground being prepared beneath feet that were always going to walk exactly here. You came to show the way, not by standing at the front of a room with a pointer, not by assembling follows or producing a curriculum, by walking through it first. by being the one who goes into the fire before anyone else even has a name for the fire, so that when others arrive at that same threshold, the path through is already scorched and traversable. The scorched earth isn't destruction, it's the road, so let me just say this plainly. And I want you to let it arrive before you reach for a reason to push it away. You do not need permission to begin. You didn't need it yesterday. You won't need it tomorrow, and more than that, the beginning has already happened. It happened every time you chose integrity over performance, every time you stayed in a room without making yourself smaller to fit what the room expected, every time something moved through you that you didn't manufacture, something that arrived, was received, and quietly shifted the temperature of the space. That wasn't practice. That was the work, already in motion. You've already begun. The only question left isn't when. It's whether you'll stop treating who you are as something that needs more preparation before it's allowed to show up fully. There's a word I want to give you for what I'm describing, not a concept, not a framework, just a word, one that names the specific movement I'm asking you to make. Acknowledgement. Not announcement. Not a declaration to anyone watching, just the quiet, interior acknowledgement that what you carry is real, that the years of navigating things others didn't have to navigate were not wasted, that the specific texture of the path you walked, the isolation, the misunderstanding, the seasons of grief that had no clean explanation wasn't a detour from your purpose. It was the ground being prepared beneath feet that were always going to walk exactly here. You came to show the way, not by standing at the front of a room with a pointer, not by building a curriculum or gathering followers, by walking through it first, by being the one who goes into the fire before anyone else has a name for it, so that when others arrive at that same threshold, the path through is already scorched and passable. The scorched earth isn't destruction. It's the road, and I want to say something about that road before we close. Every person who ever finds their footing because of something you carried, they won't know your name in connection with the ease they feel. They'll simply feel the ease. They'll feel that the thing they feared was survivable, that the territory they were afraid to enter had been entered before them. And they'll move through it carrying a fraction of the weight you carried when you moved through it first. You won't be credited for that. The scorched path doesn't credit the one who walked it. And if you've been waiting for that credit, if part of what's kept you hesitating is the acknowledgement that never arrived in the form you needed, I want to name that now without judgment, because I know what it is to wait for something that doesn't come. But the path exists regardless. It doesn't need your name on it to be real. What I'm asking you to do today isn't a grand gesture. I'm not pointing you toward a platform or a proclamation or anything that needs an audience to mean something. What I'm asking is smaller than that, and harder. One alignment. Just one. Between what you know and how you actually live in the next 24 hours. Not a complete overhaul, just the place where the gap between your knowing and your daily reality is most visible to you, and one small, honest movement toward closing it. Not for anyone watching, not to report back on, not as the opening chapter of a transformation story you can narrate later. Just the movement itself, because the Wei Shao doesn't announce the path. The Wei Shao walks it, and every step taken in genuine alignment, without performance, without needing a witness, lays more road behind you than 100 steps taken with an audience. You know which gap I'm talking about. You've known it since before this video found you. There's something you're not yet living at the full volume of what you know, and you're aware of exactly what it is. I don't need to name it. You already have. Pause. If this found you, and it did find you, that's not a metaphor, you didn't stumble here, then what I've been saying over the course of this conversation isn't new information. It's recognition, the particular feeling of being seen inside the architecture of your own experience. And if any part of what I've said has landed with the weight of something you already knew but hadn't yet found language for, let that landing be the confirmation, not my words. The resonance, that's yours. It comes from inside the structure of who you were made to be. Let me pray over you before we close. Not a performance, just a man who has walked some of this road, speaking to someone who is walking it now, asking for what I know is available. Father, I bring this person before you, not as a project, not as someone who needs to be fixed or elevated, but as someone who has already been doing the work, who is tired, who sometimes can't see, from inside the season they're in, what their presence is actually accomplishing in the unseen. Would you give them the specific, interior confirmation that their knowing is real, that the sensitivity they were told was too much is the very instrument they were designed with? That the isolation they've endured wasn't rejection, it was protection, something that needed to be formed away from the noise before it could be trusted with the weight it was made to carry. Give them rest in the knowing, not complacency. Rest, the kind that doesn't require everything to be resolved before it's permitted. I declare over this person that they carry something that was calibrated before they took their first breath in this life. That the fire they've walked through has scorched a road that others will travel and be saved from having to build. That the work is already underway, whether or not they can feel it today. I declare that the ground beneath their feet is sufficient, that what remains, when all the performance is stripped away, is enough, that it has always been enough. And I declare this, the way has already been shown. It was shown in every honest step they took when no one was watching. It is being shown now. It will continue to be shown from the place of stillness and sovereignty where they are learning to stand. Amen. Pause. I'll leave you with this. I declare that the ground beneath their feet is enough, that what remains, when all the performance falls away, is enough. That it has always been enough. And this, the way has already been shown. It was shown in every honest step they took when no one was watching. It is being shown now. It will keep being shown from that quiet place of stillness where they are learning slowly to stand. Amen. I'll leave you with this. There's a specific kind of fire that burns in a person who was built for pathfinding, not the dramatic kind. The slow, structural kind, the load-bearing kind, the kind that doesn't consume but transforms, the kind that doesn't call attention to itself but changes everything it touches, quietly, at the level of composition. You've been carrying that fire for a long time. You know what it is. You've known since you were young that something was different, that you were oriented towards something you couldn't name, that the road you were walking didn't appear on any map the people around you were using. That wasn't confusion. That was the design. If you've heard anything in all of this, let it be this. You are not becoming the person who shows the way. You already are. You have been. The only thing left is to stop hiding it from yourself. To stop waiting for more preparation before you let your full knowing be fully present, to walk the road you were made to walk, not loudly, not with announcement, but with the quiet, absolute steadiness of someone who has already been through the fire and knows exactly what waits on the other side. You came to show the way. You always have. Go now. Walk it. Who is tired? Who sometimes can't see, from inside the season they're in, what their presence is actually accomplishing in the unseen? Would you give them the specific, interior confirmation that their knowing is real, that the sensitivity they were told was too much is the very instrument they were designed with? That the isolation they've endured wasn't rejection, it was protection, something that needed to be formed away from the noise before it could be trusted with the weight it was made to carry. Give them rest in the knowing, not complacency. Rest. The kind that doesn't require everything to be resolved before it's permitted. I declare over this person that they carry something that was calibrated before they took their first breath in this life. That the fire they've walked through has scorched a road that others will travel and be saved from having to build. That the work is already underway, whether or not they can feel it today. I declare that the ground beneath their feet is sufficient. That what remains, when all the performance is stripped away, is enough. That it has always been enough. And I declare this, the way has already been shown. It was shown in every honest step they took when no one was watching. It is being shown now. It will continue to be shown from the place of stillness and sovereignty where they are learning to stand. Amen. Pause. I'll leave you with this. I declare that the ground beneath their feet is enough. That what remains, when all the performance falls away, is enough. That it has always been enough. And this, the way has already been shown. It was shown in every honest step they took when no one was watching. It is being shown now. It will keep being shown from that quiet place of stillness where they are learning slowly to stand. Amen. I'll leave you with this. There's a specific kind of fire that burns in a person who was built for pathfinding. Not the dramatic kind, the slow, structural kind, the load-bearing kind, the kind that doesn't consume but transforms. The kind that doesn't call attention to itself but changes everything it touches, quietly, at the level of composition. You've been carrying that fire for a long time. You know what it is. You've known since you were young that something was different, that you were oriented towards something you couldn't name, that the road you were walking didn't appear on any map the people around you were using. That wasn't confusion. That was the design. If you've heard anything in all of this, let it be this. You are not becoming the person who shows the way. You already are. You have been. The only thing left is to stop hiding it from yourself, to stop waiting for more preparation before you let your full knowing be fully present, to walk the road you were made to walk, not loudly, not with announcement, but with the quiet, absolute steadiness of someone who has already been through the fire and knows exactly what waits on the other side. You came to show the way. You always have. Go now. Walk it.